Getting asked a lot these days about the issue of aspirant first-time home buyers, young buyers, struggling to get into the housing market because of affordability issues. Some citing ongoing price increases in houses as one of the mounting affordability challenges. Now, I'm talking from a national average basis. The Western Cape, I think, definitely has house price affordability deterioration issues, but I'm talking for the country as a whole. In other parts of the country over the past decade and a half, since the end of the pre-2008 housing boom, house price growth hasn't been that radical. But I'm going to give a long-term perspective here, and I'm going to go back all the way to 1990 to see what has happened in terms of house price affordability, not the other related issues, affordability issues, related costs related to housing, just the house prices. On the graph you see in front of you here, you'll see a house price index with a base period at the beginning of 1990. In other words, the index is 100 at the beginning of 1990. This house price index I've strung together using an old ABSA house price index, which has a long history, to the more modern Stats SA house price index, whose history only starts in 2010. You'll see a very significant increase in house prices over that period, 1,845% cumulatively. That's massive. But that alone doesn't reflect a deterioration in affordability. We know that in the economy there's general inflation on an ongoing basis, and one of those is wage and income inflation. So we need to put per capita household disposable income into the equation too. I take a per capita household disposable income series of the Reserve Bank, index it also with the base period at the start of 1990, and what we see there is not quite as impressive, but very impressive nevertheless, 1,336% increase. So from this graph over these few decades, we can see that house prices did outpace per capita disposable income, which simplistically put would suggest a deterioration in housing affordability over the period. But there's the third variable, and that's interest rates. And we can see the prime rate put on the graph there, that in the 1990s, interest rates were a lot higher. There was one quarterly average where prime rate was 24.5%. By the end of last year, it was down to 10.4% average rate. So more than halved since those days. And in that quarter in 1998, prime rate peaked for a short time at 25.5%. That is quite extreme. So we have to put all these together in affordability calculations to see, to give us a perspective in this regard. On this graph, we see two affordability calculations, which takes the three series from the previous graph and put it all together in two different measures of affordability. The first measure of affordability is a very simple one. It's the average house price to per capita household disposable income index, all in index form. So the values are just index values. Don't read too much into them, but it's about the level and the trend. The start of 1990, this index was at a lowly 67. In other words, a relatively high degree of affordability by this measure, by historic standards. It deteriorated through the housing bubble prior to 2008, peaked. The peak level of inaffordability, if we could call it that, was in 2007 at 109. And since then, with house price growth tapering off radically post the boom years, it has receded to 92.6. So compared to 1990, this measure of affordability is significantly worse. Compared to the high of 2007 at the end of the bubble, significantly better. But for a credit-driven buyer, it's also about interest rates. That has to come into the equation. And so we put together a very simple calculation, the installment value on a new 100% loan on the average priced house as a ratio of per capita household disposable income. This ratio therefore takes interest rate fluctuations into account. As at 1990, it was 118. It peaked in 2008 in a quarter of 2008 at 137. That was extremely unaffordable by South African historic standards. We'd had this massive house price growth, and then a big interest rate hiking cycle up to 2008. The house of cards came tumbling down as a result of that extreme level of inaffordability which had been built up. House prices went into deflation, and then after that inflated very slowly, didn't keep up with per capita income. Interest rates are significantly lower today, and this index has improved quite substantially to 91.3. What's also interesting is this measure of affordability is better than at the start of 1992. Now, the composition of the housing stock is changing, that is true. So especially average stand size of houses has shrunk. There's a lot more sectional title to utilize land better. So we're not entirely comparing apples with apples in terms of the size of house and stand and design, but it gives a good idea of what the per unit affordability trend has been. And for those who are credit dependent when buying homes, it's not clear that there's been an affordability deterioration since the 1990s, where the interest rates were far higher, or even since the height of the housing bubble, after which house prices house price growth was very slow and didn't keep up with per capita household disposable income growth. So affordability by this measure, the credit dependent measure, the interest rate dependent measure, over the long term has not clearly deteriorated meaningfully. In subsequent videos, I will be discussing various factors that are tripping aspirant first-time buyers up from an affordability point of view.